We hide when we're afraid and when we believe that there's a necessity to protect ourselves. But if we are not careful, this instinctual mechanism can actually drive a lot of our barriers to deep connection with other people. I remember my grandmother, who's no longer with us, was a very hard person to get to know. Of course, she had a persona that was gregarious and outgoing and charming and all of the attributes that people knew her by. But actually, she was deeply self-conscious, and she was like an island where she didn't emote very much unless she was sort of in her element, in the happy elements of her emotional landscape. She liked to tell jokes. She liked to win people over. She liked to converse. She had a lot of opinions. And she didn't like to really share her true inner workings of whatever she was really feeling. And as a result, she had difficulty being seen as emotional and vulnerable. So much so that when her mother passed, she left after the burial, and there was the family get together afterwards. She left that early so she could go away by herself back home, a couple of hours away, and cry. And even though it was her mother and she was around family, people who she should have felt comfortable crying around, she was stoic and taking care of everybody, taking care of the event, organizing, being present, and not a single tear fell. Not a single emotion expressed that would reveal the pain that she was actually feeling. And I remember when she was sick and scared and didn't have anybody to talk to about what was happening to her. And I offered advice because I have biomedical training. I offered to read her laboratory results and to look things up on her behalf if I didn't understand it. And she refused. She refused, and I could tell that she was not even open to talking about it. And even though she had this gregarious and outgoing personality, which as she got older became more and more immersed in solitude and a little more withdrawn, which I think is normal for people after a certain point. She became a recluse. She was afraid to lean on the people who wanted to be there for her. She did lean on some people, but the people that wanted to be there for her in a way that would make her feel exposed and vulnerable, even as she was preparing for death, she could not bring herself to be seen as weak and vulnerable. And what's interesting is that many of us learn to hide and fracture parts of our personality. So we have the party personality, we have the work personality, we have the gregarious greeter, the various aspects of how we know that we will be socially accepted. And if we aren't mindful of this tendency, then we can go into our spiritual awakening and the ascension process still hiding and not integrating those abandoned parts of ourselves. And very often, we want to be seen and loved for who we are, but we are afraid to express ourselves completely, or we are afraid to have certain emotions. It's okay to have those emotions, but not those others. And so what happens, especially in my client work, is that I help people become human again, fully human, access parts of their emotional landscape that have been repressed and buried, often leading to emotional breakthroughs, some of which are challenging and result in a lot of tears or a lot of art being made, pushing the boundaries of creativity and infusing the emotion into works of art is a very powerful healing tool, actually. And what I found is that this is not a rare phenomenon. There are many people that have learned how to shut off their emotions and regulate by abandoning certain emotions like anger or rage versus working with them constructively. And as a result, they hide that part of themselves, not only from other people, but also from themselves, and will actually perceive that they don't have anger, that they're never angry. They don't have rage. Some people also hide their sadness and their depression. Other people hide their fear and overcompensate by being overly courageous. Others hide their intense reactivity and remain even keel, going through life almost apathetic at some level. And what I have observed is that many of us that have parts of ourselves that are repressed often don't feel seen, and sometimes even feel very misunderstood, almost as though we have trouble putting ourselves out there in a way that people can comprehend. And the more complex a person is, the more unseen they often feel, because their lives become a caricature of what other people want from them, hiding in the basement, in the cellar, their lost selves that only come out to play in total darkness or under the right conditions. And this actually is one of the biggest barriers to experiencing true love, in my personal opinion, because it fosters connections with people that are surface or compartmentalized. And it allows for the slipping away of our authentic self, hidden away under blankets in the winter that may or may not be seen by the person that you're supposed to be able to show everything to. And sometimes the repression is so extreme that it's almost like a denial of that old version of them, this abject refusal to remember, to admit that that adolescent or teenage version of them that suffered with shame and insecurity in certain areas ever existed on this planet. And what can happen is profoundly disturbing, that anytime anybody does something that triggers them into shame, if they're not careful, they can suddenly flip into another person. And even though there's abject denial that that version of them existed, at least in the presentation of their personality, what happens is that under the right conditions, you can actually bring that person back alive, almost as though there's a split persona in them that you can just catch a glimpse of. And if they become completely unhinged, you will meet them as though they are being recalled from the dead. You can actually see a person's face change, almost as though the musculature morphs into a person that you've never met before. I've seen it, I've witnessed it, and not just one person. It's really interesting when this happens. The first time was a very unique situation that was building and building and building. I believe that they had another person inside of them that they were used to actively suppressing, and a manufactured persona that they were presenting to the world that they had to hold very tightly onto, convincing themselves and others that they were that person, lest they remember who they actually were, that they had been trying to bury from a long time ago. And the second time I saw it happen, I was traveling in Nepal, and I met a person there who I no longer speak to. And they were trying to be kind and offer a vulnerable, comforting gesture to me that I politely declined, because I was not in the space to receive what they were offering, although I was touched by it. And they morphed right in front of my eyes into a completely different person, a completely different persona. When we have lost parts of ourselves, we very often don't know how to accept love, not true love, because we don't accept it for ourselves. And when we deny it to ourselves, how could we possibly believe in the genuine nature of anybody that's trying to offer it to us? It creates its own emotional unavailability. So the recovery of the lost selves and the integration of those selves is about recognizing that all parts of you exist and deserve to be seen and held, not only in your own emotional landscape by yourself, but also sharing with others. And through that process of reuniting with those buried aspects of you, you allow for the healing and the maturation to continue, because sometimes those parts are stunted, like they're locked away in an age range where the growing stopped. And under the right conditions, like the rejecting of your affections, it touches a wound that stuck in adolescence teenage years where you regress back to, maybe not you, but this fictitious you regress back to. I remember I recently was doing a little research project about the P. Diddy scandals. I was about to say scandal, but it's actually plural. I've been following the story because I find it interesting on a number of levels. I have an episode about it. You can check it out if it calls to you. There was a story about a waitress who had worked in New York, and P. Diddy was in theater or something where he was close by the restaurant, and after the show he would take a date, and he had this parade of women that he would take. But apparently he was self-conscious, but kept this illusion like he wasn't. And because he was nervous about it, he would stop by the restaurant before he planned to take a date, which was semi-regularly, like once a week over the course of months, if not longer. And he would go by the restaurant and he would sit down with the waitress and peruse the wine menu and pick a wine. She would tell him about it. This would be before the theater and before the date. And then she would teach him how to pronounce it. This was a very nice restaurant, by the way. And then, after the theater show, he would come in with his date parading. They'd sit down at the table, and they would go through this illusion, but his date didn't know it was an illusion, where he would pick up the wine menu, and the waitress would come over, and she would say, maybe she wasn't the waitress, maybe she was a sommelier, I'm not quite sure. She would come over and she would say, yes, can I interest you in some wine tonight? And he apparently would practice saying the wine after she would write it down on this little piece of paper. And then he would order this wine with perfect pronunciation. She'd be like, excellent choice. And she would bring it out to them and maintain this illusion that he was this connoisseur. Well, something happened where this wine that he ordered on one day in advance wasn't actually in the cellar. But she didn't find this out until after he had left and they had decided. There was no way to communicate this to him. So he comes in with the date. Can I interest you in some wine? Yes, I would like the... I'm sorry, sir. We actually don't have that one. And what she remembers is this flash of rage that came over him. And he apparently had an outburst, didn't tip her. And it was kind of a big moment. And it reminds me of when people are stunted like this, and they have a part of themselves that they are afraid to be seen by somebody else, such as not being the best wine connoisseur in the world and needing to keep up this illusion. But when you start poking around, or when life brings you the right circumstances, the next thing you know, you're lashing out at this would-be innocent person who had been faithfully helping you maintain your BS the entire time, but something that was outside of their control prevented them from doing exactly that. And instead of being reasonable about the situation, what you see is somebody change, turn into somebody unrecognizable. And in my experience, this is a darker part of hiding, when we are so afraid to be seen that it touches a rage within us. It touches a darkness that is hidden, that we don't want anybody to see. And the way we act out on that can be unfathomable. For most people, they're like my grandmother, pretending that they're not as upset or bothered. They slink away by themselves to cry and to mourn because they don't feel solace in other people's arms.